This is episode 114 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Michael Rowan Robinson. I'm an astronomer and interested in cosmology and infrared astronomy. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Graffiti was all over the place. So apparently it wouldn't have been an unusual thing for Shakespeare and his fellow roisterers, as they're described in the document, to have carved their names on the paneling of an inn.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
For the entirety of Shakespeare's life, the Tabard Inn was a well-established public inn on the main street of Southwark leading to London Bridge, and it was famous because Chaucer had set the opening scene of the Canterbury Tales there. But according to a 27-page handwritten document once owned by famous antiquary David Laing, the Tabard Inn served as a frequent meeting place for another famous poet, William Shakespeare, who gathered there with his famous friends like Richard Burbage, Ben Jonson, and other roystering associates of the 16th century, all of whom carved their names into the wooden panels of this iconic public house in an act of graffiti that immortalized them and the Tabard Inn in history. This paper record was left unnoticed for decades inside the Edinburgh University Library until a reference to it was rediscovered by Martha Carlin in 2013. Martha is professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and she joins us today to share with us her fantastic discovery, the history of the Tabard Inn, and why Shakespeare and his friends were writing on the walls there in the late 16th century. Martha Carlin is professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her research focuses on medieval towns, especially London and its suburbs, and everyday life in medieval England, with special interest in the history of food, work, shopping, the household technologies, correspondence, and inns. In recent years, her research has also turned up new evidence concerning the lives of Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, and William Shakespeare. Professor Carlin's books include Medieval London, Collected Papers of Caroline M. Barron, co-edited with Joel Rosenthal, Lost Letters of Medieval Life, English Society, 1200 to 1250, Food and Eating in Medieval Europe, London and Southwark Inventories, 1316 to 1650, A Hand List of Extents for Debts, and Medieval Southwark. Learn more about Martha and see a more complete list of her substantial publications on medieval London, Chaucer, and the Tabard Inn provided in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Martha. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. It's lovely to be here.
The record Martha discovered is a paper record of the fact that a group of men, and Shakespeare is included, carved their names into the wooden panels of a public room at the Tabard Inn. Martha, do the actual wooden panels where these names were carved still exist?
Alas, they don't. If they did exist, of course, people would have known about them for centuries. This wouldn't be new news. But the Tabard Inn, the one that Shakespeare would have known, and the one probably also that Chaucer would have known in the late 1300s, it survived until 1676, and then it burnt down in a great big fire that devastated the central part of Southwark, the southern suburb of London, across the Thames from London, where the Tabard Inn was located. And after it was burnt down in 1676, it was rebuilt. And the rebuilt inn survived for another 200 years, and then it was demolished in the 1870s. So the wooden panels that Shakespeare would have carved his name on presumably survived as curiosities, at least until 1676, but they've been gone since then.
Was carving their names into wooden panels an act of vandalism or respect? It seems odd for someone like Shakespeare to carve his name into a building.
Well, it wasn't until I stumbled across this document that I started thinking about the prevalence of graffiti in the past. And all archaeologists and most history buffs who are interested in places like Pompeii know that graffiti was a very common thing to see in the ancient world as well as in the medieval and post-medieval worlds in Europe. But once I started thinking about it, I realized that graffiti was all over the place in at least the later Middle Ages in Europe, and certainly in the early modern period when Shakespeare was alive, and in the generation or so after his death when these notes were made. So apparently it wouldn't have been an unusual thing for Shakespeare and his fellow roisterers, as they're described in the document, to have carved their names on the paneling of an inn that they patronized and where presumably they met for convivial drinking sessions. So what's remarkable is that a generation after Shakespeare's death, an antiquary whose name we don't know and who was interested in the medieval antiquities of London and its suburbs, he was interested in the Tabard Inn because of its association with Geoffrey Chaucer, who set the opening of the Canterbury Tales there. And he also clearly was interested in Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and Richard Burbage, their colleague, and other colleagues who carved their names on the panel of the Tabard Inn. And he wrote about the Tabard in general, and he wrote about these carvings in particular, suggesting that they were something of a showpiece for visitors to the inn, that Shakespeare and his colleagues who left their names there were still so celebrated 30 years or more after they had died in some cases, that this visitor found it remarkable and made a note of it.
Now, as you say, they were known kind of as a group, these roystering associates, which is how the record phrases it there. Now, was this normal, though? Like, I know apparently we can tell they were famous, but was it popular or common for these groups of playwrights to get together and form this kind of club, or were they unique for their lifetime?
Well, this record that I discovered, or more fairly to say rediscovered, in Edinburgh University Library a few years ago, this is the only known record of Shakespeare having a circle of buddies with whom he socialized. It is one of the very few records of Shakespeare in his personal life as opposed to his professional life. And it is the only known piece of evidence for a kind of literary fellowship that Shakespeare might have engaged in. There are some later anecdotes that some scholars have discounted, that Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, who was his fellow playwright and fellow poet, but not fellow actor in the company of the King's Men, that Shakespeare and Jonson supposedly engaged in wit combats where they would trade quips and smart remarks and so on and challenge one another to kind of verbal duels, presumably. And these anecdotes date from later in the 17th century, from the last half of the 17th century. And some scholars have thought that it's a myth. It's a fable. It's not based in reality. The thinking is that Ben Jonson is known to have joined a club of politicians and lawyers who met at the Mermaid Tavern in the city of London in the decade after 1609. But Shakespeare wasn't a member of that fellowship, and he didn't attend those meetings, presumably. So scholars have tended to look askance at Fuller's anecdote about the wit combats between Shakespeare and Jonson. But this little smidgen of information from this unknown antiquary writing perhaps around 1643 suggests that Shakespeare and Jonson did socialize together along with some fellow members of the company of the King's Men. And indeed, perhaps Shakespeare and Jonson then really did have those kinds of verbal duels, but it would have been at the Tabard and not in the city.
I certainly hope they did. It's exciting. Now, you're talking about the idea of flighting. Is that the right word for that kind of verbal combat?
I mean, I have to say that's a word that I'm not familiar with, that a real Shakespeare scholar would be familiar with. I'm a medieval historian, and I am by no means a Shakespeare scholar or an early modern historian. But if flighting means to have sort of playful, lively sort of verbal contests.
It does. Yes. It's like an early modern rap battle is the way that it occurs.
I like that. That's clever.
Now, most of the names on this record are recognizable. Obviously, William Shakespeare, and you mentioned Richard Burbage and John Fletcher and Ben Jonson. But there was one name that I don't recognize at all, and that is Sir Sander Duncombe, I think is how you, okay. Now, who is he, though?
He's the odd one out in this list of men who carved their name on the panels, whose names were noted by the anonymous antiquary who left the mysterious notes. Sir Sanders Duncombe was at least a generation, probably more than a generation younger than Shakespeare. He was knighted in 1617. He was Justice of the Peace in Middlesex in the 1640s. In the 1630s, he crops up in some interesting ways. He introduced the concept of sedan chairs to England. He apparently had been traveling in France and had seen this provision for carrying people around in covered chairs in towns where coaches were not practical because the streets were too narrow or too steep. And King Charles I, who was king beginning in 1625 after the death of his father James, Charles I clearly warmed to the idea that London could have that kind of carriage system because London's streets were too crowded with coaches and carriages and carts and wagons, and it was dangerous and it was inconvenient for everybody. So he gave Sir Sanders Duncombe a monopoly to develop a sort of a taxi system, but one based on not on wheeled vehicles, but on these covered chairs that were carried by two porters, one in front and one in back. The other thing about Sir Sanders Duncombe that's very curious in the 1630s is he's mentioned in the diary of John Evelyn as having in 1635 attempted to cure Evelyn's mother who was dying using a special powder that apparently was celebrated and that Sir Sanders Duncombe was known for. It didn't work. It didn't save her life, but Evelyn was grateful apparently that he had tried. And at the end of the decade in 1639, Sir Sanders Duncombe got another monopoly from the king, this time for keeping wild animals who were to be baited in public, so for wild animal battles. And he apparently kept bears at his estate in Islington. And there was a terrible episode, I think in 1642, when apparently one of his bears killed a gardener, and some contemporary made a note of that. So Sir Sanders Duncombe pops up in all these interesting ways, but he's not connected in any way that I'm aware of with Shakespeare or with the theaters, which of course had been closed in 1642 during the English Civil Wars.
I almost wonder if he has any connections with Philip Henslowe, who also had the bear baiting and was responsible for the animals in the theater.
I apologize that I can't remember this, but it's possible that Henslowe was the sort of earlier generation of bear masters. I think that Sir Sanders Duncombe may have had a monopoly that would have excluded Henslowe beginning in 1639, but I'm sorry to say I just don't remember Henslowe's activity.
Duncombe was obviously this fascinating entrepreneur. You can see why he would have taken up with people like Shakespeare and Jonson anyway, even though it is kind of odd to see his name on that list.
My guess, and it's only a guess, is that he was an admirer of what he knew of Shakespeare and Jonson and their roystering associates, and that he visited the Tabard either to have a drink or to stay the night, or because it was a literary shrine. When he saw Shakespeare's and Jonson's and so on's names on the walls, that he added his own name as perhaps a homage to these great stars of the past, the poets and playwrights, as well as the actors.
I like him already. I'm definitely going to start calling me and all of my Shakespeare friends a cacophony of roystering associates from now on.
Great.
The 27-page document Martha uncovered is handwritten on paper, and the handwriting is beautiful, but it does beg the question of who wrote it. Martha, do we know who wrote this record in the first place?
I would love to say yes. I've actually been working intermittently for the last 7 years on trying to identify the unknown author of these notes, but I still have been unable to. There was one moment when shortly after I had discovered them and photographed them and transcribed them, one of the pages has the large initials J.E. on it.
Oh, tantalizing.
And I was, for one brief shining moment, I thought, could this be John Evelyn, the young John Evelyn? Because a number of the topics that are mentioned in his notes are actually topics that are familiar to Evelyn, or people that he knew, or places that he knew. And I tried to see if I could match the handwriting to examples of Evelyn's early handwriting. And I tried to trace Evelyn's connection with the various topics. And I found they just didn't fit. It was such a wonderful, fantasy that
it had
these notes
so
could have been
much
written
promise.
by Evelyn.
Yeah.
But I've convinced myself that they're not by Evelyn. Alas, alas, alas. One of the most important connections that I was hoping for between Evelyn and J.E. is that J.E. knew and was friendly with the Bohemian artist Wenceslas Hollar, whose very celebrated panorama of London, which was made in the 1640s and was drawn from the tower of the tallest church in Southwark, which is now Southwark Cathedral, that Hollar and J.E. were friends. Hollar gave J.E. a drawing, and J.E. has some notes reminiscing about his friendship with Hollar. But although John Evelyn also was friendly with Hollar, none of the other points are a good fit. And Hollar was in England in the early 1640s. So it all seemed plausible, but unfortunately for this fantasy identification, it wasn't a match. So I'm still looking to see if I could possibly track down who the unknown author. And the initials J.E., of course, are not necessarily those of the author of these notes. It's just that they're the only unexplained initials that are in the notes. So it's possible that they are the author's initials. The author was evidently a young royalist, a man, not a woman, because he reminisces about a young lady whom he calls poor Mabel Acton, and he muses that if ever he were to marry, it would be with Mabel Acton. And she evidently was the daughter or granddaughter or ward of an old knight who was not named by the anonymous antiquary. And apparently he was in some way turned out of his house or otherwise harmed by the parliamentary Colonel Oakey, who came to his house and either arrested him or turned him out or told him he had to show up to be interrogated or something. So this anonymous compiler was a young unmarried royalist who had a romantic interest in a young gentlewoman called Mabel Acton, and who took notes on the medieval antiquities of Southwark and Hackney especially, but also some stray notes from London and other London suburbs of medieval antiquities.
Now, as Martha points out, she was not heading in the direction of looking for Shakespeare history. Actually, her expertise is in medieval history and not Shakespeare at all. So, Martha, where were these papers when you found them? Were they part of a larger collection? How did you stumble across these?
It's a really funny story, and it's an example of how sometimes really interesting discoveries come from very improbable origins. In the summer of 2013, I was in London doing research, among other places, in the manuscripts room of the British Library. And a good friend from America emailed me that she was coming in a couple of weeks to Scotland to sing in a choir concert in Edinburgh. And would I come up and visit with her and see the concert? And I thought, I've only got a couple of weeks left to work here. I've got so much to do, but of course it's an old friend, so of course I've got to go. So I wrote back and said, yes, I'll see you there with pleasure. And then I thought, what kind of research can I do in Edinburgh that would help me to be productive in this use of the time? So because I was in the manuscripts room of the British Library, it has shelves and shelves of library catalogs in it that tell you about other libraries' medieval manuscripts. So I went to the Edinburgh section of these library catalogs, and I looked first at the catalog of the National Library of Scotland to see if there was anything about medieval London or Southwark or other interests that I have that would show up in that catalog that I could perhaps see when I was in Edinburgh. And I didn't see anything that grabbed my interest. So then I looked at the other catalog of medieval manuscripts in Edinburgh that was available, and that was the catalog of the University of Edinburgh's library, their special collections library. And what they have is not a printed catalog, but rather scans of old typescript slips of paper that used to be in a kind of card catalog and that were published in sort of photographic facsimile in a limited edition of copies. And the British Library had one of those copies. And I did what I always do with manuscript catalogs. I look up London and Southwark in the index, and then sometimes I look up other topics as well. And in this sort of photographic facsimile typescript catalog on slips of paper that the University of Edinburgh's special collections had, under London antiquities, there was a reference to the Tabard. And I thought, well, that's curious. I've been working on Southwark for decades and I haven't run across this reference before. So I looked up the slip, and the slip mentions this sort of curious anecdote about Shakespeare's graffiti carved in the wall of the Tabard Inn. And I thought, that's just amazing. How could nobody have known about this? So I Googled the University of Edinburgh Library's Special Collections Director's Office telephone number and eventually found it and telephoned the director just cold and explained that I was anxious to see these sets of notes.
You're suddenly much more excited about the choir performance now.
Well, I was thrilled with both, but I was only going to be in Edinburgh basically over the weekend. And special collections in Edinburgh University Library, as in most libraries, they're closed on the weekends and they're closed in the evenings. They're open Monday through Friday from 10 to 5 as usual.
Right, sure.
They couldn't allow me to see it during the time when I was booked to go to Edinburgh. But the director, with enormous kindness and generosity, asked his assistant to just snap some photos with her phone.
Oh, perfect.
And email me those scans. And so I could see from the scans, although they were fairly rough, I could see that this looked like a genuine thing, that it wasn't just a fantasy or it wasn't a mistake for a 19th century set of notes or something, that it looked genuine. But unfortunately, that I was unable to see them in person that year. The next year, when I was back in London, I made an appointment to go up to Edinburgh and to see and photograph the notes. And so that's when I was able to get a proper transcription and to work on them properly.
That's exciting.
So it's just a sheer accident that I happened to be planning a brief visit to Edinburgh that made me look at that catalog. The other thing that's useful to note about this anecdote is that it was the most old-fashioned way possible of finding a document, that there's no published catalog, there's no online catalog, there is nothing except these typescript slips, which happen to have been sort of photographed and circulated in a limited way to other research libraries.
We weren't going to Google this, yeah.
So
exactly.
And the collection of manuscripts in which these notes form a part is this huge granny's attic of documents that was given to Edinburgh University Library in the 1870s by an antiquary called David Laing. There are perhaps as many as 1 million documents in this collection, and the collection is uncatalogued. It is a total granny's attic.
That's amazing.
Individual items are known. Some of the items in this collection are very celebrated, but the vast majority of the documents in the Laing collection are completely uncatalogued. So all I can suggest is...
So if someone's looking for a project, we found one.
Absolutely. Or a few lifetimes worth of projects.
Precisely. Like we need a team of people.
That's right.
The historian John Stowe wrote a survey of London in which he recorded that by the 16th century, the Tabard Inn was one of several inns in Southwark, including what he says is, quote, many fair inns for receipt of travelers by these signs: the Spur, Christopher, Bull, Queen's Head, Tabard, George, Hart, and King's Head. The Tabard is famous today because of its lasting connections to Chaucer and Shakespeare. But Martha, was the inn famous in its day more so than the Queen's Head, the Hart, or some of the others?
I think the Tabard in Shakespeare's day was quite celebrated for its connection to Chaucer. That Chaucer was seen as the father of English literature and the father of English poetry. And poets such as Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, who wrote poetry as well as dramas, they revered Chaucer. They thought they were very familiar with Chaucer's work and they thought very highly of it. There were publications of Chaucer's works that were printed by printing presses in their own day. And there was historical interest in Chaucer. So since the Tabard had survived, and in fact, the notes that this unknown antiquary had produced, in addition to the lines that I published in my article in the Times Literary Supplement in 2014, there's also one other interesting sort of aside that the unknown author wrote. He wrote, "The old inn is of timber nearly, meaning mostly of timber, presumably partly of brick, and very large, and appeareth to me to have been but little changed, as may be seen by the inside. So the tabard was clearly distinctive in the 1640s or thereabouts, not only for its associations with Chaucer and now with Shakespeare and Jonson and their fellow roisterers, but also because it looked so medieval, because it was very large, because it was still mostly timber built. The Tabard Inn had been expanded since Chaucer's day. In the 16th century, after the English monasteries were dissolved by Henry VIII and the lands confiscated, the Tabard Inn, which adjoined one of these monastic properties, took in the monastic property to its north, and that included some buildings that were later rebuilt in brick. So the site in Shakespeare's day was bigger than it was in Chaucer's day, since it included the adjoining property. But apparently the main building of the inn still looked ancient to somebody writing around 1643, being made primarily of timber and having apparently a very antique-looking interior. So it must have been quite a distinctive inn in a high street full of inns and drinking houses. The Tabard must have stood out for its antique appearance, as well as for its very, very extraordinary literary association.
Now, I know you mentioned it's in Southwark and on High Street, but geographically, describe for us where the Tabard is in association to the Globe.
The Tabard is about a quarter of a mile due south of the foot of London Bridge. And the Globe was on Bankside, which was due west of the foot of London Bridge. So the Tabard was roughly half a mile by foot from the Globe Theatre.
So it wasn't really that far away. This was something that was a convenient visiting spot for someone like Shakespeare that spent a lot of time in this area.
Well, the High Street was the prime street of inns and drinking houses in medieval and early modern Southwark. And in fact, it remained distinctive for its inns until the coming of the railroad put them out of business in the 19th century. So it would have been the place where a bunch of young guys who were looking for a drink and a place to socialize, the High Street would have been a natural place for them to go, and they could well have sampled all the inns there and all the drinking houses. We'll never know.
So it's kind of like a main street of town.
It was, but it was the main business street, and it was the main street for hospitality, for inns, for taverns, for alehouses. But my guess is that Shakespeare and Jonson, at any rate, and maybe Burbage and Fletcher as well, that they chose the Tabard because of its associations with Chaucer. I think that it's very likely both Shakespeare and Ben Jonson were so familiar with Chaucer's work and so reverential towards it that I think it's quite possible that they specifically chose the Tabard because of its associations with Chaucer.
We associate Shakespeare with inns in other ways in terms of performance, and the 19th century sketches of the Tabard Inn, and now this was after it was rebuilt post 1676 fire in Southwark, but the sketches that I've looked at show a courtyard, and it's a lot like some of the inns that we know Shakespeare performed plays at. Would Shakespeare have been going to the Tabard to perform a play?
There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that any plays were performed in the Tabard, either by Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, or by anybody else. Does that mean it couldn't have happened?
So it simply wasn't that kind of establishment. Okay.
So far as I know, it was not used for the acting of plays. That those inns that were used have been recorded, but so far as I'm aware, the Tabard was not one of them.
Certainly a great hanging out spot if you want to be an immortal poet in the eyes of posterity, at any rate. I know we would love to explore more about the Tabard. It's just a fascinating place, and certainly this record that you've rediscovered, we would love to know more about it as well. What are some of the books and resources you can recommend we use to explore this further?
Oh, goodness. For those who are interested, as I am, in the medieval background of all this, I have myself written a book on medieval Southwark. It gives the fullest depiction of the development of Southwark in the Middle Ages, and it focuses on the period from about 1200 to 1550. So Shakespeare was born in the 1560s, so this brings Southwark up to just before Shakespeare's own birth. I have also written an article called Shakespeare at the Tabard, which was published by the Times Literary Supplement in 2014. 2014. And that kind of outlines my thinking about these notes and what they represent. And it also sadly reveals that J.E. almost certainly was not John Evelyn.
That's just too bad. That would have been so nice.
Disappointing, I know. But better to be able to rule him out and then focus one's research elsewhere.
Exactly.
And there is also a study that I have made of Chaucer's host, which is in a book called Historians on Chaucer, which was edited by Stephen H. Rigby and published in 2014. And in that article, I discuss the history of the Tabard Inn, the history of its innkeeper in Chaucer's day, a man called Henry Bailey or Henry Bailiff, who was a real person and who is clearly the model for the fictitious Harry Bailey, the host of the Tabard Inn in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So if you're interested in the real Henry Bailey or Bailiff and the real Tabard Inn, as well as what Chaucer made of them and how he reconfigured them in the Canterbury Tales, you might want to have a look at that article. There's one other source that I think your listeners might find interesting, looking at more material on Shakespeare at the Tabard Inn, and that is the entry in the online exhibition catalog from the Folger Shakespeare Library. This is an exhibition that they did in 2016 on Shakespeare's life that commemorated the 400th anniversary of his death in 1616. And the exhibition included the notes of our unknown antiquary from Edinburgh University Library's special collections. They were put on display at the Folger, and photographs of them are still available in the online catalog entry. So to find this online catalog entry, search for the phrase Shakespeare the Roysterer at the Tabard Inn. And there you will find a photograph of the notes and a transcription of the notes and an essay by me on the notes and everything connected with them. It was a great exhibition, and it's wonderful that the catalog is still available online.
We'll link to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, so make sure you go there to learn more about Martha, her research, and read these articles she's recommended. Now, Martha, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
And it has to be just one book, huh? It can't be something like the Encyclopedia Britannica.
I've had people choose the Encyclopedia Britannica, had one enterprising mind choose an iPad.
Oh, that, I guess I would sign on to that. If I truly had to choose just one work, I probably would, and as long as you're allowing encyclopedic works, I probably, other than the Encyclopedia Britannica, which would be a splendid choice, I would also think about the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which was published in print in 2004, and which is available online. I would use that iPad for this, and assuming my desert island had a Wi-Fi connection. And the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography is an amazing, amazing resource, and it could keep one happily occupied on a desert island for many years.
Well, you'd be well set up on your deserted island for sure. And I think, yes, if we're going to allow encyclopedic works, we should also allow Wi-Fi, so you could have that as well.
Oh, great.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, it's not unrelated. I'm working on a book on the rise of inns and innkeeping in medieval England. I think that this is actually an almost not studied subject, and I'm beginning to think that it's a really important one. I think that inns and innkeeping arose in the 1300s. That doesn't mean that there were no inns before 1300, but I think that they were comparatively few. Whereas after 1300, and especially after the Black Death, which was in the late 1340s, after 1350, let's say, the evidence appears to be that commercial inns were popping up everywhere, in small places as well as large places. And I think that this is a really important new industry, commercial innkeeping, not brand new, but new in its volume and its widespreadedness. And I think that it was it had a big impact on social manners, on the economy, on travel, on the ability of people of modest means to travel safely and respectably from place to place. And I think that Chaucer absolutely was on to the novelty of this when he chose the Tabard Inn in Southwark as the setting for the opening of the Canterbury Tales, where 29 pilgrims all meet up in this southern suburb of London to spend the night and have dinner before setting off the next day on their 3-day journey to Canterbury by horseback. And the fact that Chaucer set the opening in a commercial inn, in a public inn, where people of both sexes, of all degrees of social status and wealth, both ecclesiastics and lay people, where they all stayed comfortably and their horses stayed comfortably and they were well fed, the people and the horses both, that really marks this great innovation in travel in Chaucer's day. I think people have always assumed, as I formerly did, that inns were a commonplace to people of Chaucer's generation. I think they weren't. I think they were a novelty. And that it's like Chaucer, if he were writing today, it would be, I don't know, if Chaucer were writing 20 years ago, if he set the opening of his equivalent to the Canterbury Tales in Starbucks, that would be sort of the equivalent.
Right. Well, I was going to say Holiday Inn, but yeah, I was thinking it's the same kind of, we're used to there being, hotels and places to stay.
That's right. But, just as Starbucks was very innovative and very game-changing as a place where people want to gather as well as want to grab a cup of coffee, I think that was true with these rapidly spreading and rapidly becoming grand enough for very elite people to stay in them, these public inns of Chaucer's day, including the Tabard, that they were a real novelty and very exciting and very important. And Chaucer nailed it by setting his great work there.
Well, Martha Carlin, thank you so much for visiting with us today and walking us through the history of the Tabard Inn. I am personally impressed with just your tenacity and persistence when you have this question to be answered for historical research. And I appreciate you sharing the fruits of your labor with us today and helping us learn more about this iconic location from Shakespeare's life. Thank you so much for being here.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me, Cassidy.
Some of the images from the Folger Library's digital exhibition, as well as links to Martha's publications on the Tabard Inn and the sketch from the 17th century, which shows the Tabard Inn as it looked after the fire of 1676, are all found in the show notes for today's episode. Find links to all of that history and even more information on William Shakespeare at cassidycash.com/episode 114. That's cassidycash.com/EP114. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right! That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at cassidycash.com/experience. That's cassidycash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.